The last thing Edna Mae Calloway owned that had belonged to her mother was a Bible with a cracked spine and a water stain on the cover, shaped like an open hand. She carried it in her purse the way some women carry photographs, not because she opened it every day, but because the weight of it was familiar, and familiar things matter more than anyone expects once everything else is stripped away. She was 72 years old. She had been, in her time, a wife and a bookkeeper and a woman who could hold 7 columns of figures in her head simultaneously. For 44 years, she had been Raymond Calloway's person, and he had been hers, and the life they had made together in Clarksville, Tennessee was not remarkable to anyone who passed it on the street. It was a 2-bedroom house with a screened porch and a vegetable garden that Raymond tended with a devotion he never extended to housework. They had no children. They had a 20-year-old cat named Biscuit and a Sunday routine that had not changed in 3 decades. The newspaper, the crossword puzzle, the corner booth at the diner on 4th Street where the waitress knew their order before they sat down. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Raymond died on a Tuesday morning in March. He was at the kitchen table with his second cup of coffee when his heart stopped. By the time the paramedics arrived, he was already gone. The coffee was still warm. The newspaper was open to the crossword. 3 clues answered in Raymond's heavy pencil print, the rest of the squares blank. Edna could not bring herself to throw that paper away for 6 weeks. She had known, in some abstract way, that widowhood was a real thing that happened to real people. She had attended funerals, held other women's hands through their losses, said the right words at the right times. Applying that knowledge to herself proved to be a different thing entirely. For 44 years, the assumption of Raymond had been as automatic as breathing. He was there when she woke up. He was there at the end of the day. When she had a problem, she talked it through with Raymond. And when he had one, he talked it through with her. And they were better together at most things than either of them was alone. She had never had to test what she was like without him. She found out she was capable. She went to work each morning at the dental practice on 2nd Street, where she had kept the books for 23 years. She did the grocery shopping. She watered Raymond's garden, though she could not have fully explained why, because he had cared about it, and she found she could not let it go to seed. The tomatoes came in that August, more than she could use, and she brought bags of them to neighbors and to the church hall, because Raymond would have done that, and the tomatoes did not know he was gone. 6 months after Raymond died, her mother followed. Ola Pearl Jessup had been 91 years old and unwell for several years. The doctors had warned Edna. None of that made the end easier. Edna drove to the hospital in Clarksville and sat beside her mother's bed and held her hand and watched her breathe until the breathing stopped. And then she stayed for another hour in the silence because there was nowhere else she needed to be and no one waiting for her to come home. The funeral was on a Saturday in September. Edna's brother Gerald gave the eulogy. He was 6 years older than her, a broad man with silver hair and the practiced warmth of someone who had spent 40 years selling insurance policies to people anxious about their futures. He spoke about their mother with real tenderness. He talked about Ola Pearl's cooking and her patience with grandchildren and the way she had always known when someone needed a phone call more than a letter. People cried. Gerald's wife passed out tissues from her purse. Edna sat in the front pew and watched her brother speak and felt something she could not name at the time. She named it later. Dread. Their father, Cletus Reuben Jessup, had been dead for 12 years by then. Clete had farmed 110 acres in Robertson County for most of his working life, tobacco first, and then soybeans when the market changed, and the farmhouse had been in the Jessup family since the early 1900s. 2-story white clapboard with a porch that ran the full front of the house, a barn behind it that smelled like every decade of accumulated work, a cellar Edna's mother had stocked with preserved vegetables every fall. Edna had grown up there. She had tracked mud from those fields to school every October. She had learned to drive in the back pasture, stalling her father's truck 12 times before she got the hang of the clutch. She had sat on that porch with Ola Pearl on summer evenings listening to a radio that only pulled in clear signal in the right weather, and she had returned to sit there again as an adult, because some places take hold of you early and do not release you cleanly. Gerald had moved their parents to an assisted living facility in Nashville 4 years before Ola Pearl died. He arranged it while Edna was recovering from knee surgery, calling it a practical decision, a safety matter, something the doctors had suggested. Edna did not fight it. She was in pain and medicated, and Gerald was the older one, the one who had always stepped in when things needed managing. She had accepted that characterization for most of her life without examining it closely. The farm was listed for sale 4 days after the funeral. Edna found out when the listing agent called her by mistake. The woman had been trying to reach Gerald to confirm a showing time and dialed the wrong number. She apologized, hoped the estate was moving along smoothly, asked whether Edna thought the listing price was reasonable. Edna said she would call back. She put the phone down and sat at her kitchen table for 20 minutes. Then she called Gerald. He answered on the second ring. "When were you going to tell me?" she said. "I was going to call this week." He did not sound apologetic. He sounded like a man who had prepared for this conversation and found it going as expected. "The farm is part of Mom's estate. It belongs to both of us." "It belonged to both of us," Gerald said. "The deed has been in my name since 2019. Mom and Dad transferred the property before the move to Nashville. Estate planning. Avoids probate. Their attorney handled everything. Nobody told me that. They did what they felt was right. I had power of attorney." She asked to see the documents. He said he would send them. That week passed. The week after passed. The farm sold. $380,000 to a developer from Nashville who wanted the land for a housing subdivision. Gerald received the proceeds. Edna received nothing. She hired an attorney in Clarksville who specialized in estate disputes. They filed a claim with the probate court on grounds of undue influence and improper transfer. Her attorney was careful about promises, but not without optimism. The records would tell the story, she said. They filed discovery requests for all documents related to the transfer, the deed change, the power of attorney, the estate paperwork. Gerald produced documents. Everyone signed, notarized, dated correctly. Edna's attorney studied them for 3 days and said the signatures appeared consistent with Clete and Ola Pearl's handwriting. The chain of title was clean on paper. Then Edna's attorney asked for the original will. Gerald said there was no will. Their parents had died intestate, he said. The property had been transferred before death and was outside the estate entirely. There had been a will. Edna knew because she had been in the room when her parents discussed it with an attorney in 2014. She could still see the kitchen table, the pitcher of sweet tea, the attorney's briefcase open on the floor beside his chair. Her parents had planned to leave everything equally to both children. That had been said aloud, agreed upon, written down. When Edna's attorney tried to locate the will through county records, it was not there. The attorney who had drafted it had retired and his files transferred to another firm, but that firm had no copy. Gerald said he had never received one. The file was incomplete. The documents that might have supported Edna's claim had simply stopped existing. Her case collapsed. The court found no grounds to overturn the transfer. Gerald had sold the land, kept $380,000, and the documents that could have changed the outcome were gone. Her attorney said it plainly, sitting across the desk on a gray Thursday afternoon. "I cannot prove anything without the original documentation. Someone made sure I wouldn't have it." Edna drove home in the dark. She sat in her car in the driveway for a long time. She thought about Gerald at the pulpit giving their mother's eulogy. How warm he had sounded. How practiced. She sold the house in Clarksville. Without Raymond's pension and without any share of the estate, she could not cover the mortgage, the taxes, and her own expenses on a part-time bookkeeper's income. She got $214,000, paid what she owed, and moved into a one-bedroom apartment on the east side of town that cost $750 a month. The previous tenant had smoked inside for years, and the smell had worked its way into the walls in a way that no amount of cleaning fully cleared. She was not broken by it. She was too old and too tired for broken, and the anger she felt did not come out as collapse. It was banked low and patient, like coals that stay hot long after the fire is out. She did not call Gerald. She did not contact her attorney again. She went to work each morning, came home in the evenings, cooked her dinner, and sat on the small balcony with Biscuit, who had survived every upheaval of the past year with the consistent indifference of a creature that has learned the world will continue regardless. Before the farm sold, she drove out there once. She was coming back from her attorney's office and took the turn toward Robertson County without thinking too hard about it. She parked at the end of the driveway and sat with the engine off and looked at the farmhouse with the for sale sign in front of it. Someone had painted the porch railing recently, white and neat. The grass had been mowed. It looked like no one she had ever known had lived there. She sat for 40 minutes and then drove home. She did not go back. The personal belongings were divided through a mediator at Gerald's request. He arrived with a list he had prepared beforehand. He took the silver and the china and the cherrywood writing desk from their parents' bedroom. He took the framed family photographs and the jewelry box and the hand-quilted bedspread their mother had made in pieces over 40 years. He was thorough. He left Edna the cast-iron cookware, a cedar chest that smelled of lavender, a box of old letters from relatives she barely remembered, and the Bible. He left the Bible because it was worn and cracked and worth nothing on a list of assets. Edna put it in her purse without opening it. She drove home. She put the Bible on the nightstand the way she had seen it on her mother's nightstand her entire life. It sat there for 7 weeks. On a Thursday evening in October, Edna was looking for a pin in the bottom of her purse, and her fingers found the Bible's spine. She pulled it out and set it on the kitchen table. Biscuit came to investigate, sniffed the cover, walked across it, and settled at the far end. Edna opened the book. The pages were marked throughout in her mother's handwriting, that small, cramped script Ola Pearl had used her whole life. Dates written beside certain passages. Words underlined. Names in the margins next to verses she had returned to over the years. Dried flowers pressed between some pages, translucent as paper now. Near Psalms, Edna found a note in her mother's hand. For Edna when she needs it. Romans 8 verse 28. The verse was underlined 3 times. Near the back of the book, her fingers found something different. A slight thickness between the pages of Jude and Revelation. She turned back and looked. Pressed flat, so flat it had taken the shape of the book around it, was a folded piece of paper. She pulled it out with 2 fingers and unfolded it on the table. It was a deed. A property deed, hand-typed on legal paper, dated March of 1961. The property described was 40 acres in Stewart County, Tennessee, recorded with the county clerk, lot number and survey description running down the page in the formal language of county records. The grantor was a name she did not recognize, an old family name, someone who had sold land in Stewart County 63 years ago. The grantee was her father, Cletus Reuben Jessup. 40 acres in Stewart County. Edna read the document twice. Then she set it on the table and looked at it. She had grown up hearing about the Robertson County farm her entire life. Stewart County had never come up, not once, in 72 years of knowing her father. In all the evenings she had sat with him on the porch, in all the truck rides to town, in all the years of watching him work the Robertson County land, he had never mentioned 40 acres in another county. The deed was real. She could see the county clerk's stamp at the bottom, the notary seal, the signatures. The paper was aged but intact, preserved by the Bible's pages for decades. This was not a copy. This was the original document, which meant her father had held it personally, had folded it himself, had slipped it between these specific pages of Ola Pearl's Bible. He had hidden it here. For a reason. Gerald had gone through the farmhouse with his list. He had identified everything of value and taken it. He had not taken the Bible because a worn, water-stained Bible is worth nothing to a man counting an inheritance in dollars. He had missed this entirely. He had no idea it existed. Edna folded the deed along its original crease lines and held it in both hands. Outside, the parking lot below her balcony sat quiet under a single street lamp. Traffic moved on the road beyond the fence. Biscuit stepped onto the deed, regarded her briefly, and moved to the chair beside her. She thought it through. 40 acres in Stewart County, purchased in 1961 in her father's name, separate from the Robertson County farm, never mentioned in any estate proceeding because no one had known to mention it. Her father had held the original deed personally, not through an attorney's office, not through any joint account. He had put it inside a Bible, and that Bible had traveled through her mother's keeping for the rest of their lives. Gerald could not burn documents he had never found. The next morning, Edna drove to the public library and asked for help searching property records for Stewart County. A librarian walked her through the county assessor's database online. Edna typed in her father's name. The parcel came up immediately. 40 acres, Stewart County, Rural Route 4, off County Road 112. The record showed continuous assessment since 1961. Taxes paid without interruption through 2009. After that, through an automatic draft account her father must have set up before his health declined. The account was small, funded years ago, running low. The taxes for the current year were 4 months overdue, not enough to trigger a lien yet, but the next billing cycle would change that. There was a structure on the property. The assessor's record described it as a residential dwelling, stone construction, pre-1940, single story. No improvements recorded since 1963. Edna wrote down the parcel number and the address. She closed the browser and sat in the parking lot with the notebook on her knee. A stone house. 1 story. No improvements since 1963. 40 acres in a county she barely knew, owned by a man who had told her nothing about it, and hidden the only proof of his ownership inside her mother's Bible. She drove home and fed Biscuit and sat at the kitchen table with the deed and the notebook side by side. She thought about her father, about the particular quality of his silences, which had been a feature of his character her entire life. Clete Jessup was not a man who explained himself. He worked, and he was kind, and he fixed what needed fixing, and he did not often say what he was thinking. Edna had grown up accepting that as simply who he was. It struck her now, at 72, sitting in a cigarette-scented apartment in Clarksville, that she had never questioned it. She had never asked what he was doing in the barn those evenings when the house went quiet. She had never asked why, when she was about 8 years old, the cellar door on the Robertson County property had been cemented shut. Her mother had said the cellar flooded. Her father had said nothing. Edna had believed the explanation and forgotten the question for 60 years. She got out the road atlas and found Stewart County, north and west of Clarksville, a rural county strung along the Tennessee River. Small county seat, farmland and forest. Not much else. 2 hours from where she sat, maybe a little more. On a Sunday morning 3 weeks after finding the deed, Edna packed a bag. 3 days of clothes, her medications, her notebook, her phone, and the Bible. She put Biscuit in his carrier, over his sustained objections. She loaded the carrier into the back seat of her 12-year-old Honda Civic, set the deed on the passenger seat beside the notebook, and pulled out of the apartment parking lot. She drove northwest on Highway 79. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of October day that sharpens everything at its edges. Flat farmland gave way to rolling hills and cedar-covered ridges and the occasional glint of water between trees. She stopped for gas in a small town she did not catch the name of, bought a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been sitting since dawn, and drove on. Stewart County came into view through the windshield as 2 lanes narrowed to 1.5, and the signage began referring to roads by number rather than name. She drove into the county seat around 9 o'clock, a town of perhaps 3,000 people, a main street with a hardware store and a barber shop and a county courthouse that looked like it had been built in the 1940s and not significantly altered since. She found the county clerk's office in a low brick building beside the courthouse. A woman about 40 named Beverly confirmed the deed's registration within 10 minutes of Edna explaining the situation. She turned her computer screen to show the parcel record. The property had been recorded in Cletus Jessup's name since 1961. The deed had never been amended or transferred. Because Gerald had filed the Robertson County farm as the sole estate asset during the brief and uncontested probate proceeding, and because no will had been located, this parcel had simply gone unaddressed. "It's yours," Beverly said. "As his surviving heir of record, you have a clear claim. File an affidavit of heirship, and we can get it recorded today." Edna did the paperwork on the spot. Beverly stamped it and filed it. 45 minutes, start to finish. She got directions to County Road 112 and drove south out of town, following the road as it narrowed from asphalt to packed gravel, and the cedars closed in on both sides. She passed 2 farmhouses and a cattle operation and a barn that had collapsed against a hillside at some point in the last decade and been left where it fell. Then the road curved left, and she saw the mailbox rusted through in places, the numbers still readable, the wooden post leaning about 10 degrees from vertical. She turned in. The driveway was nearly lost, barely a suggestion of gravel under years of encroaching grass and young saplings pushing through. Trees on both sides had grown tall enough to close over it in places, forming a canopy that filtered the light into something green and dim. The car moved through it slowly. Then the trees opened, and she saw the house. It was stone, field stone, laid by hand from whatever the ground in that county gave up, fitted together with a care that had not loosened in decades. 1 story, long and low, with a pitched roof that had held its shape. The windows were intact, which surprised her. The front door was still on its hinges. Vines had taken most of the east wall and were working across the eaves, and the yard had gone entirely to tall grass and young trees pressing in at the edges. But the house itself stood solid, the way stone things do when they are built right and left to themselves. Edna sat in the car with the engine running and looked at it. Her father had owned this place since 1961. He had never brought her here, never mentioned it, had held the deed in his own hands for the rest of his life, and then let it disappear inside her mother's Bible without a word of explanation. The house had been standing here through every year of Edna's existence, through her childhood and her marriage and her working life, and her grief, standing here in the trees along a gravel road in Stewart County with no one knowing it belonged to her. She turned off the engine. She got out of the car. The grass was wet with morning dew, and the air smelled like cedar and cold earth, and something older underneath, the smell of a place that has been closed for a long time. A crow moved in the tree line to the left and went quiet. Biscuit made a sound from the back seat, and she told him to give her a minute. She walked to the front door and put her hand on the knob. The door opened. The house smelled like time. Not decay exactly, the stone walls had kept the worst of that out, but something older and drier, the accumulated smell of decades of still air. Edna stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The front room ran the full width of the house. A stone fireplace at the far end, tall enough to stand in at the hearth. 2 chairs positioned facing it, covered in a fine layer of gray dust. A side table between them with a glass still sitting on it, empty, leaving a ring in the wood. Someone had sat in one of those chairs on some evening long ago and set a glass on that table and gotten up and left, and no one had been back since. The floor was wide plank oak, warped slightly in places where moisture had found its way in over the years. A wool rug under the chairs had gone stiff and colorless. On the wall beside the fireplace, a framed photograph hung slightly crooked, the glass fogged with dust. Edna crossed the room and took it down. She wiped the glass with the hem of her sleeve. 2 men stood in front of the barn, not the house, the barn behind it, which she had not yet seen. Young men, both of them, early 30s maybe, wearing work clothes and squinting into bright sun. The man on the left had his arm around the other man's shoulder. She did not recognize either of them at first. Then she looked more carefully at the one on the left. The set of the jaw, the way he held himself, shoulders slightly forward, weight on his back foot. Her father, Clete Jessup, young, decades younger than she had ever seen him. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting she knew from grocery lists and birthday cards and the deed she had found in the Bible, her father had written, Cedar Hollow, 1961. The day we finished it. Cedar Hollow. She looked around the room. This house, this property, this was Cedar Hollow. Her father had been here in 1961 and written those words on the back of a photograph, and then had pressed a deed inside her mother's Bible and never said a word about it to a living soul. She set the photograph on the mantelpiece and kept moving. The kitchen was at the back, separated from the front room by a doorway with no door, just the frame. A wood-burning stove, too old for propane, iron legs rooted to the floor. A sink with a hand pump for water, dry now, but the mechanism still intact when she tested it with both hands. Open shelving on one wall held canning jars, empty, their lids rusted to the rims. The window above the sink looked out at what had once been a kitchen garden. She could still see the shape of the beds under the overgrowth, the outline of where someone had once grown things with care. On the wall beside the doorway, a calendar hung on a single nail. The month showing was September. The year was 1963. Edna stood in the kitchen threshold and looked at that calendar for a long time. September 1963. Someone had been here then, had turned that calendar to September of 1963, and had not come back to turn it again. She looked down at the floor. The kitchen floor was fitted slate, cooler than the oak in the front room. She walked it slowly, testing each step. Near the center of the kitchen, her foot found something different, a slight variation underfoot, barely perceptible. But she was a woman who had spent 23 years paying attention to the details that did not announce themselves, and she felt it. She crouched down. The slate in the center of the kitchen floor was not original. She could see it now, a slightly different color to the stone, a hairline irregularity in the way the pieces met, running in a rough rectangle about 4 feet by 3. Someone had laid new slate over an older feature and done a careful job of blending it in. She pressed her ear to the floor, and rapped her knuckle against the center of the rectangle. The sound came back hollow. There was a space underneath the kitchen floor. She stood up. Her knees ached from the crouch. She walked back through the front room and found the other door, a bedroom at the east end of the house. The windows choked with vine, so the light inside was green and dim. A bed frame, no mattress. A dresser with 3 drawers, 2 open and empty. The third was stuck. She worked at it with both hands until it came free. Inside the drawer was a small cedar box, perhaps 8 inches long and 4 wide, with a brass latch gone green with age. She lifted it out and carried it to the front room where the light was better. She opened the latch. Inside the cedar box, a folded piece of paper, a stub of pencil, and a photograph. The photograph showed her father again, alone this time, standing at the entrance to what looked like a hatch or a low opening in the ground, holding a lantern in one hand. He was younger in this one than in the photograph on the mantelpiece, but older than she expected for the early 60s. Late 30s, maybe 40. He was looking directly at the camera with an expression she could not read. Not pride, not fear. Something between the two, or underneath them both. She unfolded the piece of paper. Her father's handwriting. The same careful print, each letter slightly separated from the next, the way men of his generation wrote when penmanship had been treated as a moral quality. The note read, 12 left, 7 right, 33 left, 9 right. If you are reading this, you already know where to use it. Nothing else. No name, no date, no explanation. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Edna folded the note and put it back in the cedar box with the photograph. She latched the box and held it in her lap and sat with it for a while. Her father had left a combination somewhere in this house, or in something in this house, that connected to something underneath the kitchen floor. He had hidden the note in a cedar box in a stuck drawer in a bedroom that had been sealed since 1963. He had put the deed to this property inside her mother's Bible, where a man counting assets in dollars would never think to look. He had arranged the pieces so that someone looking carefully enough, someone who already knew this was hers, could find them. Clete Jessup had planned this, not with any certainty that she would come, but with the patience of a man who had decided that the right person, if she looked, would find what he had left. She thought about that. She thought about her father coming out here twice a year, stopping at the hardware store, talking to neighbors in the way he always talked to people politely, without giving anything away. Coming to this house, sitting in these chairs, looking out at the garden he had once grown things in. Keeping a secret for 30 years after the last time he had turned a calendar page. He had been hiding something from someone. And the Bible had been the lock on the door that led to the combination that led to whatever was underneath the kitchen floor. 3 layers between Gerald and what this property held. Her father had not known Gerald. He had not known Edna's life. But he had known that the one thing a greedy person overlooks is the thing that looks worthless. She put the cedar box in her coat pocket and went outside. The barn was 40 yards behind the house across what had once been a yard. It was wood, unlike the house, and the decades had been harder on it. The south wall had bowed outward, and one section of roof had given up entirely, letting weather in. But it was standing. She pushed the door open. Inside, rusted tools on the walls, an old plow that had not moved in 50 years, hay on the floor gone gray with age. And the floor itself, she saw it immediately, was concrete. Poured concrete, smooth, running wall to wall. She walked to the center of the barn and looked down at it. She knocked her heel against it in several places. Solid throughout. The hollow space was under the kitchen. Not here. She went back inside and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the slate floor. Whatever was down there, the entry was from above, and the slate over it was not something she could lift with her hands alone. She needed help, and she needed tools she did not have. She spent the first night in the front room. She cleared the dust from one of the chairs with her coat sleeve and sat in it while the light faded outside. She had brought a sleeping bag from the car and laid it on the floor where the old rug had been. Biscuit, released from his carrier, walked the full perimeter of the house in the systematic way cats do when claiming a space, and then settled on her feet with the authority of a creature that has decided a place will do. She slept better than she had in months. She was awake at 5:30. 44 years of Raymond making coffee at 5:30 had reset her internal clock past any easy adjustment. She pumped the kitchen sink until the water ran clear cold, good well water, and washed her face and hands. She made coffee on the camp stove she had brought from the car and stood at the kitchen window in the early light, looking out at the shape of the old garden beds under the weeds. The calendar on the wall said September 1963. She thought about what her father had been doing in that year. 41 years old, working the Robertson County land, raising 2 children, driving that old green truck. She would have been 9. In 3rd grade. She had no memory of him being absent for any extended stretch. Whatever he had been doing at this property, he had done it in the margins of the life the family had known about. He had kept 2 lives perfectly separated for the better part of 2 decades, and then he had sealed one of them under a kitchen floor and locked it, and let the key travel through 60 years inside a Bible. After coffee, she drove into town. She needed tools, and she needed to understand what she was actually dealing with before she removed anything. She stopped at the hardware store on the main street Benson's, according to the sign above the door, and a man about her age was behind the counter pricing stock. His name was Earl Sutton. He lived on the property adjoining her father's to the north. She told him who she was. That Cletus Jessup was her father, that she had just inherited the property through a deed she had found tucked away in an unlikely place, that she was out there now trying to understand it. Earl set down the can of wood stain he had been holding and looked at her. Clete's daughter, he said. You knew him? Some. He came through town 2 or 3 times a year when he was working the property. We'd sit on the bench outside the post office sometimes. He was a private man. We talked about the weather, about the county road conditions, about nothing much. Earl paused. I always figured whatever he was doing out there was his own business. Did he ever say anything about what he was building? Earl thought about it. Once he said he was finishing something he had started a long time ago. I took it to mean repairs. He was the kind of man where repairs could mean anything. He looked at her steadily. Why? What did you find out there? She told him about the kitchen floor. The hollow sound beneath the slate, the rectangular section that had been laid differently from the rest. She said she needed to get through it, and she did not have the right tools. Earl was quiet for a moment. He had a hammer drill he could borrow from a neighbor, he said. A cold chisel set. Pry bars. He could come out the following morning with what she needed. I can't pay you, Edna said. I know you can't, Earl said. Your father was a good neighbor by the only measure that counts. He left people alone. He expected to be left alone. That arrangement worked fine for 15 years, and that's worth showing up for his daughter. She thanked him. She bought the cold chisel set and a pry bar and a box of heavy garbage bags and a headlamp from a shelf near the back. She drove out to the property and spent the rest of the day preparing. She moved the canning jars off the shelving. She swept the slate floor carefully, examining the sealed section in the afternoon light. She pulled the dead vines away from the east window to let more light through. In the afternoon light, she could see the outline of the sealed section more clearly. The mortar between the slate pieces over the rectangle was thinner than the surrounding floor, more careful, as though someone had tried to blend it in and had mostly succeeded. She ran her finger along the seam and felt where it gave slightly, chalky and thin. She had been a bookkeeper for 23 years. She knew what careful concealment looked like when the numbers almost but not quite added up. That evening she sat in the chair by the fireplace and opened the cedar box again. She looked at the photograph of her father holding the lantern. She turned it over. No writing on the back of this one. She looked at his face and thought about what she knew of him, which was less than she had always believed. He had grown things and fixed things and said very little about either. He had come to her school events and not said much afterward. He had been steady and present, and she had accepted his presence as a simple fact of childhood without ever asking what was underneath it. She was asking now. 60 years too late to ask him, but asking. Earl arrived at 7 o'clock the following morning in a truck whose color had been beaten into ambiguity by decades of weather. In the bed, a hammer drill, a generator to run it, extension cord, a box of concrete chisels, 2 sledgehammers of different weights. He handed a thermos through the window without asking if she wanted coffee. She did. She poured 2 cups into the thermos lid and the spare mug she had brought from the apartment, and they stood on the porch and drank before going inside. What are we expecting? Earl asked. I don't know, Edna said. And because he had driven here with a generator and 2 sledgehammers without needing to be talked into it, she added. My father left a combination written down. For numbers. I found them in a cedar box in the bedroom. I think what's under the floor is what the combination opens. Earl set his mug on the porch railing and looked out at the property. Your father built this place? He bought it in 1961. The deed says there was already a structure. I think he did a lot of work to it after that. Earl nodded slowly. Deliberate man, he said. It was not a question. They carried the equipment inside. Earl set the generator at the kitchen door and ran the cord to the drill. He crouched over the slate section, pressed his palm flat against it, knocked his knuckles across several spots, tilted his head to listen. This was set separate from the rest of the floor, he said. You can feel the difference. The surrounding floor is bedded deep. This section is sitting on something of frame, I'd say. Wood frame underneath. The mortar on top is a quarter of what it should be. He looked up at Edna. This was meant to be removable. Someone added the mortar afterward to keep it shut. He started with the cold chisel and the lighter sledgehammer, working the seam along the edge of the rectangle in short, controlled strokes. The mortar crumbled cleanly. It was thin enough that it gave without much resistance, the way something will give when it was never intended to hold permanently. After 20 minutes, he had opened the full perimeter, the chisel tracing the rectangle from corner to corner. He fitted the pry bar into the gap at the near edge. Wood frame underneath, he said, and showed Edna where the lumber showed through old timber, dark with age, the grain tight from decades of bearing weight. This whole section was built as a hatch, the slates set into a frame that was designed to lift. He worked the pry bar around the edge, loosening what remained of the mortar seal. Then he looked at Edna. You want to take the other end? She did. She crouched and got her hands under the frame at the far edge. Earl had the pry bar working the near end. He counted quietly 1, 2, and on 3 they lifted together. The slate section came up as a single panel, 12 individual pieces set into a wooden frame that held them together. It weighed more than it looked. They walked it sideways and leaned it against the kitchen wall. Beneath it was a steel plate. Flat gray steel, perhaps a 1/4 inch thick, set flush into a poured concrete frame. No handle. No obvious hinge from this angle. On the near side, recessed into the surface, was a combination lock, the older style, mechanical, a spinning dial with numbers worn into the face. Decades of disuse had stiffened the mechanism, but the metal was sound. No rust through. No corrosion on the dial. Edna stood over it and looked at it for a moment. Earl stepped back without being asked. He went to the kitchen window and stood looking out at the overgrown garden, his back to the room. Edna crouched beside the steel plate. She took the cedar box from her coat pocket and unlatched it and unfolded the piece of paper. She set the paper where she could see it and took the lock in her right hand. The dial was stiff. She applied steady pressure. 12 left. She turned the dial counterclockwise, counting each number as it passed the marker. Stopped at 12. 7 right. Clockwise, slowly, counting against the stiffness of the mechanism. Stopped at 7. 33 left. Counterclockwise. She did not rush. She had never rushed a ledger when the numbers had to be right, and they always had to be right. 9 right. Clockwise. 9. She held the lock. She did not pull it yet. Her father had built this or helped build it in 1961 and had sealed it in 1963 and had hidden the combination in a cedar box in a stuck drawer in a bedroom no one had entered since. He had hidden the deed in a Bible. He had let 60 years pass and had trusted that the right person, if she was paying attention, would find both. He had known she might not find it. He had also known she was the only one who might. Edna pulled the lock. It opened. She set it on the floor beside her. The steel plate had a finger recess on one side that she had not seen from above, a shallow groove along the edge, just wide enough for 2 hands. She worked her fingers into it and lifted. The hatch was heavy, heavier than the slate panel, and it swung on hinges that groaned from decades of disuse but held. Earl crossed the room and took the weight of it, and together they laid it back against the cabinet behind them. Cool air rose from the opening. It was not the damp cold of a flooded space or the sour cold of somewhere sealed without ventilation. It was dry and still and sharp with something she did not recognize at first. Something faintly sweet. Something old. Below the hatch, a steel ladder descended into darkness. 8 rungs, she counted, anchored to a concrete wall. Edna put her headlamp on. She gripped the top rung and looked at Earl. I'll go first, he said. No. She looked at him steadily. My father left this for me. I go first. Earl nodded. He stepped back. Edna put her foot on the first rung and started down. The headlamp cut a narrow cone of light through the dark, and Edna counted the rungs as she descended. 1, 2, 3. The concrete wall beside her was smooth and cold under her palm. 4, 5. The air thickened as she went down, dry and faintly sweet, and she recognized it, the smell of old metal, the way a jar of pennies smells when you open it after years on a shelf. 6, 7, 8. Her feet found the floor, and she steadied herself and turned around. She stood still for a moment before she moved the headlamp. The room was larger than she had expected. It ran the full footprint of the house above, perhaps 30 feet by 20, with a poured concrete floor and concrete walls lined with shelving from floor to ceiling. The ceiling was low, reinforced with steel beams embedded in the concrete overhead. Each beam sitting in a poured socket with the kind of precision that takes time and someone who cares whether it lasts. On the far wall, a ventilation grill sat flush with the surface, and she could hear the faint breath of a fan somewhere behind it, still running after all these years on some slow clockwork mechanism her father had built to protect what was stored here. He had built it to outlast him. It had. The shelving units were wooden, sturdy and square, made by someone who had built them to last, and succeeded. They ran the full perimeter on 3 walls, and down the center 2 freestanding units created a narrow aisle between them. Every shelf held something. Edna moved the headlamp slowly from left to right and took stock of what she was seeing. The left wall held trays. Flat wooden trays divided into small padded compartments, each compartment holding a coin. The trays were stacked 4 high and ran the full length of the wall, perhaps 40 trays in total. She lifted the nearest one carefully. Morgan's silver dollars, large and heavy, each sitting in its own felt-lined hollow. She had seen pictures of Morgan dollars in library books, the Liberty head profile, the spread-winged eagle on the reverse. These were the real thing, in hand, and the weight of them was different from the weight of pictures. The earliest date she could read was 1878. She set the tray back and moved to the next section. More trays, these holding piece dollars, the design slightly more modern, date range beginning 1921. She counted 14 trays in this section alone. Below the piece dollars, on the lower shelves of the left wall, the trays gave way to small leather pouches. She took one and loosened the drawstring. Gold. Small gold coins, each about the size of her thumbnail. She held one up to the headlamp. A date, 1910. A woman in profile on one side, a walking eagle on the other. She recognized what she was holding without being able to name it yet. She recognized the weight of it, specifically the particular density of something that had never lost its value regardless of what happened around it, regardless of banks closing or orders signed or families divided. There were rows of these pouches, 2 full shelves of them running the length of the left wall. The right wall held wooden crates sealed with metal clasps, stacked 2 high across the entire wall. She worked the clasp on the nearest crate and opened it. Inside, wrapped individually in oilcloth that had kept them clean and dry through decades of sealed air, pocket watches. She unwrapped the nearest one. Silver, hunter case, heavy in the palm, the cover engraved with a pattern of leaves. She clicked it open. The movement was visible through a small window in the inner case. The gears still, the mainspring long wound down, but the mechanism intact, undamaged. She rewrapped it carefully and looked into the crate. Perhaps 30 watches in this one alone. She looked down the wall. 8 crates. Beside the crates, toward the far end of the right wall, a locked metal strongbox sat on a lower shelf. The key was still in it. She turned the key and the lid opened. Inside the strongbox, stacked in flat bundles held together by paper bands gone brittle with age, paper currency. Not ordinary bills. These were larger than current bills, with a distinct design she recognized from photographs she had seen of old money. She lifted the top bundle and held it under the headlamp. Across the top of the nearest bill, in gold lettering, gold certificate. Series 1928. The denomination on the face was $100. She counted the bundles without removing them from the box. 12 bundles. She fanned one open with great care. 20 notes per bundle. She did the arithmetic without a calculator, because she was a bookkeeper and arithmetic was automatic. At $100 face value each, one bundle alone was $2,000 in face value. 12 bundles was $24,000 in face value. But these were not face value items. These were 1928 gold certificates, Legal currency retired from circulation in 1933 when the government went off the gold standard, preserved in a sealed concrete room in the dry air of a Tennessee hillside for 60 years. She closed the strongbox. She set her hand flat on the top of it for a moment. At the far end of the room, opposite the ladder, a small workbench stood against the wall. She had not seen it on her first sweep of the room. She walked toward it down the narrow center aisle between the shelving units. And as she walked, she ran her fingers lightly along the edges of the wooden trays, the leather pouches, the crates, all the things her grandfather had chosen one by one over 30 years of careful accumulation, and her father had added to over the years after that. 60 years of patience pressed into shelves. A family's whole careful secret, waiting in the dark. On the workbench surface, held flat by a small river stone sitting on top of it, was an envelope. White once, now yellowed to old cream. Her name was written on the front in her father's handwriting. Edna. Just that. One word. She picked it up and turned it over. The seal was wax, hardened and cracked at the edges from age, but still holding the flap closed. She broke it and pulled out the letter. For pages, folded in thirds, the paper thin and covered on both sides with her father's careful print. She held it under the headlamp and began to read. Her father wrote, Edna, if you found this letter, then you found the note in the cedar box, which means you found the deed in your mother's Bible. I put it there because your mother would keep it safe without knowing what she was keeping, and because the one person who might search for it would never look inside something with no dollar value. I hope I was right about that. I expect I was. Your grandfather, my father Elias Jessup, was a careful man in the way that men who grew up poor and watchful are careful. He worked the Robertson County land his whole life, and he did one other thing: he collected coins. Not for sentiment, for permanence. He did not trust paper money after 1929, and he did not trust banks after he watched 3 of them close in 18 months. Every dollar he could spare above what the farm needed, he converted. Silver first, then gold when he could manage it. He built his collection over 30 years, quietly, through dealers in Nashville and Louisville, through private sales, through patience. When Roosevelt signed the order in 1933 requiring citizens to surrender their gold, Elias did not comply. He put the gold in a dry place and said nothing and kept his land. Nobody asked. He left the collection to me when he died in 1957. The number he gave me for its rough worth scared me enough that I knew I could not keep it at the farm, where anyone curious enough and patient enough might eventually find it. I needed somewhere else. Somewhere with a deed in my name alone, not in both our names, so that if anything ever happened it would not fall into a dispute. The man in the photograph with me is Arthur Dees. He was my closest friend for 30 years. He helped me build this room in 1961 and took the secret of it to his grave without ever telling a soul, because that was Arthur. I added to the collection over the years the paper currency and the watches, acquired through estate sales and private sellers. Things that were old and overlooked and therefore cheap. I had a gift for finding what other people did not know the value of. I stopped coming here in 1963. There was a man watching the property and asking questions in town about who owned it, and I did not know his reasons. I sealed the room and stopped coming. The man eventually stopped asking, but by then I had built a habit of leaving this place alone, and the habit became years, and the years became the rest of my life. I should have told you. I should have brought you here when you were old enough to understand and shown you what your grandfather built and told you it was yours. I did not, because I am a man who finds it easier to build things than to explain them, and because I was afraid that if I told you it would change something between us that I did not want changed. That was a cowardice, and I am sorry for it. The coins are worth real money, more than the farm ever earned. A reputable auction house will tell you what you have. There are firms in Nashville that handle collections of this kind. Go to them directly. Do not go to anyone who offers to buy before they have told you the value. Your grandfather was careful his whole life. Be careful with what his care produced. The only condition I put on any of it is this: use some of it for something that lasts. I do not mean a building or a monument. I mean something that goes on after you are gone and does some good while it is going. I leave the specifics to you, because you were always better at the specifics than I was. The room is yours. What is in it is yours. I am sorry it took so long to reach you. Your father, Clete. Edna lowered the letter. She stood in the sealed room her father had built 60 years ago and read those last 2 sentences again. The room is yours. I am sorry it took so long to reach you. She stood there for a while, without moving. The ventilation fan breathed its slow breath in the wall. The headlamp lit the letter, then the shelves, then the letter again. She thought about him coming out here twice a year over 15 years, driving the long way down through Robertson County and west into Stewart County, stopping at Ruth's store for coffee, sitting on the bench outside the post office talking about the road conditions. Building this room in secret with his closest friend, adding to it piece by piece through estate sales and private sellers, maintaining the ventilation and the climate and the organization of things he had no intention of selling. A man who found it easier to build things than explain them, building something he could not explain for the one person he trusted to use it right. She folded the letter along its original crease lines and put it back in the envelope. She put the envelope in her coat pocket with the cedar box. Then she climbed the ladder. Earl was waiting in the kitchen. He had made coffee on her camp stove while she was below, and he handed her a cup without asking anything and waited. She drank half the cup. Then she said, "My grandfather collected coins. Pre-1933 gold, Morgan silver dollars, peace dollars. My father added paper currency and pocket watches. He built the room in 1961 with his closest friend. It has been sealed since 1963. Earl looked at the open hatch in the kitchen floor. He looked at Edna. He did not say anything for a moment. "Is it real?" he said. "I believe so. I need to have it appraised." Earl nodded slowly and finished his coffee. "Your father was something else," he said. "He was. I just didn't know which something until now." She drove to Nashville 4 days later and found the auction house her father's letter had named a firm on the west side of the city that had handled estate collections for 30 years. A man named Garrett Hale met her in reception, trim and unhurried, the kind of manner that develops in people who work with things that cannot be rushed. She told him what she had found, showed him photographs on her phone, and placed 3 pieces on his desk: a Morgan dollar, a peace dollar, one of the pre-1933 gold coins, and 1 gold certificate, handled carefully using the clean cloth she had brought from the property as makeshift gloves. Garrett examined each piece in silence. He used a loop on the coins, taking his time with each one. He leaned over the gold certificate with both hands flat on the desk, reading its surface in the way that people who have handled rare things for decades learn to read them, through the eyes rather than the fingers. "The Morgan is an 1879 S," he said. "Graded conservatively at MS 63, somewhere between $800 and $1,200 for this single coin. The gold piece is a 1910 Indian head eagle, genuine, $1,600 to $2,200 at auction in this condition. The gold certificate is Series 1928, $100 denomination. These have sold between $3,000 and $8,000 per note, depending on series and condition." He looked up at her. "You said there are 40 trays of coins, 12 bundles of currency, 8 crates of watches." He said it as a confirmation, not a question. "I need to come and see the full collection in person." Garrett drove to Stewart County 6 days later with 2 colleagues, a specialist in pre-1933 United States gold coinage and a woman who handled estate paper currency. They spent 2 full days in the sealed room with their equipment and their reference catalogs, photographing and weighing and cross-referencing every piece with the concentrated patience of people doing work that cannot be hurried without being ruined. Earl sat on the porch both days and made sure no one came up the driveway uninvited. He did not ask Edna for updates. She appreciated the steadiness of that. On the second evening, Garrett sat across from Edna at the kitchen table with his notebook. "The coins are the most substantial element of the collection," he said. "Your grandfather selected for quality as well as quantity, and the sealed storage conditions have preserved them far beyond what we typically see in private collections of this age. The Morgan and Peace silver dollars include several key dates and mint marks that will draw significant collector interest. The pre-1933 gold is exceptional. The Indian head eagles in particular are in a condition range that will bring premium prices. The paper currency is unusual for its completeness. 240 notes, all series 1928, in a condition range from extremely fine to about uncirculated. The watches are a mixed collection, but the rare pieces are meaningfully rare." He paused and looked down at the notebook. "Our preliminary estimate for the full collection, sold through curated lots over 12 to 18 months to protect the price, is between $2.1 and $2.8 million. Edna sat with that number. She was a bookkeeper. She understood what numbers meant in the context of real things. She understood what $2.1 million meant. She also understood that the Robertson County farm had sold for $380,000 and that Gerald had kept every dollar of it while she moved into an apartment that smelled like other people's cigarettes and rationed her retirement savings and went to work part-time at a dental practice because she had no other choice. She signed Garrett's contract 3 weeks later, after her attorney in Stewart County reviewed it and returned it with 2 minor amendments the auction house accepted without argument. Gerald found out 6 weeks after the contract was signed. The auction house issued a press release as standard practice, building collector interest before the first lot went to auction. It did not name Edna. It described the collection as a significant private holding discovered in Stewart County, Tennessee, the product of 3 generations of acquisition beginning in the 1920s. A regional news outlet ran the story. A journalist in Nashville expanded it with more detail about the pre-1933 gold and the gold certificates. Within a week, it had circulated through the coin-collecting community and into several general interest publications. The county was named. The family name was not. Gerald called on a Tuesday afternoon. Edna was in the kitchen garden, clearing the beds her father had once grown things in, working her way methodically along each row. She came inside and answered. "Is it you?" Gerald said. No greeting. No preamble. "Hello, Gerald. The Stewart County story. The collection they found. Is it you?" "Yes." A pause. She could hear him breathing clearly through the phone. She had known Gerald's breathing since they were children sharing a house in Robertson County, and she could read the register of it. This was the breathing of a man recalculating every assumption he had made in the last 2 years. "How much?" he said. "Enough." "Edna." His voice shifted, took on the careful shape of something he had prepared. Whatever Dad had stored out there, that is family property. The estate was never fully settled. There may be a claim here that there is no claim, Gerald. You cannot know that without a legal, the deed to the Stewart County property was purchased by Dad in 1961 in his name alone, she said. It was never included in any estate proceeding. It was never listed as an asset in the Robertson County probate filing, because you did not know it existed and neither did I at the time. It passed to me as his surviving heir through an affidavit of heirship recorded with the county clerk. The collection stored on the property is personal property of the deed holder. My attorney has reviewed all of it. She let a moment sit. There is no claim. Silence. The Robertson County farm, he tried. What I handled there, the transfer, I want you to understand that it was, I understand what it was, Gerald. He stopped. I am not going to spend the rest of my life angry at you, she said. That is not what I have time for. But I am not going to pretend you did not do what you did. You took the house that belonged to both of us. You made documents disappear. You did those things deliberately, and I think part of you has always known that someday the weight of them would come back around, even if you did not know what form it would take. She paused. You missed the one thing that mattered. That is the reckoning. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its prepared shape entirely. Edna, goodbye, Gerald, she said. Take care of yourself. She hung up. She stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking out at the half-cleared garden in the afternoon light. Then she went back outside and picked up the loppers and kept working. She did not hear from him again. The first auction lot sold in March, 11 months after she had descended that ladder for the first time. 50 Morgan silver dollars, curated for condition and date range, sold to 3 separate buyers for a combined $64,000. Garrett called the same afternoon with the number and the wire transfer details and a quiet note in his voice that she recognized as a man who is pleased with how something has gone. She paid off the lease on the Clarksville apartment. She paid the Stewart County property taxes for the next 10 years in a single check, which Beverly at the county clerk's office accepted without remark, having seen stranger transactions in her years at the desk. She opened an account at the county bank, the first bank account she had opened in her own name alone in her adult life, and she sat in the chair across from the bank manager and felt, for the first time since Raymond died, that she was building something rather than watching something disappear. Then she started work on the stone house. Earl helped her find the people she needed. Within a month, she had a roofer, a plumber, and an electrician working the property in shifts. The roof needed resealing in several sections. The plumbing required new lines run from the well the old galvanized pipe had corroded through in places over the decades. The electrical work was the largest job. The house had never had power, had been built in a time before this part of Stewart County was on the grid, and running a new service connection from the county road took 6 weeks and 2 inspections. While the tradespeople worked, Edna worked around them. She cleared the kitchen garden herself, down to bare soil, and replanted it in April with the things she could see her father had once grown there, the old plant markers still legible in a few places along the bed edges. Tomatoes along the south exposure, beans and squash in the main beds, a row of herbs along the fence. Earl's wife appeared one Saturday morning with a flat of seedlings on the porch step and drove away before Edna could open the door to thank her, which was exactly the way that kind of help was given in that county. The second auction lot sold in June, the third in September, the fourth the following spring. Garrett managed the pacing with the care her father's letter had asked for, releasing the collection in portions that kept the prices strong and the buyers interested. By the end of the second year, the collection had realized $2.4 million in total. Edna kept what she calculated would carry her through the rest of her life with comfort and without extravagance. She was not interested in extravagance. She had been a bookkeeper her whole working life, and she knew what numbers meant when placed beside real things, and the number she needed to live well in a stone house in Stewart County, with a garden and a neighbor who came by on Tuesdays and a cat who had decided the property was satisfactory, was not a large one. The remainder she put toward a scholarship fund established through the Robertson County School District, the schools she had attended as a child, where her father had dropped her off and picked her up for 12 years without saying much about education beyond the fact that he had paid for it and expected her to take it seriously. The fund was named for Elias Jessup. It went to students from Robertson County whose families worked the land, students who might otherwise have had to stop at the county line. She did not announce it publicly. The school district issued a small notice in the local paper. That was enough. Some things do not need to be witnessed to count. On an evening in early October, 2 years after she had turned the key in a lock that had been waiting 60 years for her to find it, Edna sat on the porch she had built onto the front of the stone house. Cedar boards on a stone foundation, wide enough for 2 chairs and the small table between them, where she set her coffee in the mornings and her tea in the evenings. The fields around the property had gone to the gold and rust that the hills in this part of Tennessee put on every October like a habit they cannot break. Biscuit occupied her lap with the complete conviction of a cat who considers all flat surfaces his by right of presence. The cedar box sat on the table beside her tea. She had not opened it in months. She did not need to. She knew what was inside the photograph of her father holding the lantern, the note with 4 numbers in his careful hand, and knowing was enough. There are things you stop needing to look at because you have looked at them long enough that they are inside you now, part of the way you see everything else. She thought about what her father had written at the end of his letter. Use some of it for something that lasts. Not a building. Something that goes on after you are gone and does good while it is going. She thought she had done that. She thought Elias, who had spent 30 years converting spare dollars into silver by lamplight in a Robertson County farmhouse because he did not trust the systems that were supposed to protect ordinary people, might have recognized where his patience had eventually landed. Earl's truck appeared at the end of the gravel drive and slowed at the road the way it always did, one hand raised through the window before he drove on. The signal that meant everything is fine, nothing needs doing, see you tomorrow. She raised her hand back. The thing about a sealed room is that it does not disappear when you open it. The room is still there. The concrete walls are still poured and sound. The shelves are empty now, but the wood is solid. Her father's letter is still on the workbench in its envelope, the small river stone sitting on top of it, the same stone he had used to hold it flat through 60 years of dry sealed air. She had put it back herself after the appraisers finished their work. It felt right to leave it. She goes down there sometimes, not for any practical reason, only because it is her father's room and it is hers, and she has earned the right to stand in it. She thinks, standing there in the dry, still air, about what it takes to build something for a person you cannot see yet. To arrange the pieces carefully and lock the door and let the years go by in the faith that the door is still holding, still waiting, and that the right person will eventually arrive and know what to do. Her father had that patience. His father before him had built a whole life around it. Edna had spent most of her years believing she had inherited Clete's stubbornness and Ola Pearl's practicality. She understood now that what she had actually inherited was the one quality that made both of those things useful. She knew how to wait for what was hers. And when the time came, she knew how to open the door. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.